All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour, where China's crackdown against the pro-democracy figures in Hong Kong continues. And in the latest, believe it or not, the police have arrested about 5 people on suspicion of publishing seditious material. The region is considered as semi-autonomous, but is slowly slipping, it appears, under Beijing's draconian laws. The China-backed security forces in Hong Kong said that the content that was being published was intended to incite hatred in children towards the Chinese government. The 2 men and 3 women who've been arrested worked for a union that produces and publishes books for children. And according to reports that have emerged, as being said that some stories in the books depicted wolves and sheep as characters, which may have alluded to the events that unfolded in Hong Kong since the pro-democracy protest began in 2019. Now, at this point of time, none of these details can be confirmed. However, the police have said in a statement, and I quote the Hong Kong police here, "The public must be aware of the facts and must not tolerate or glorify violence, let alone the next generation be incited by false and distorted information and go astray." The 5 individuals have been arrested under the new controversial security law targeting sedition. This law, remember, was revamped and was widely implemented amidst the anti-government protests in the former British colony. First convictions under the law can carry a maximum penalty of nearly 2 years in prison. Meanwhile, 4 staff members from the now-closed pro-democracy Apple Daily newspaper were also denied bail. 2 top editors and 2 editorial writers have been charged for colluding with foreign forces under the national security law. The reports further state that the judge rejected the bail applications because there was not enough evidence to show that the defendants will not commit further acts endangering national security. The case has been adjourned until the 30th of September. Executive Editor-in-Chief Loman Chung was the 8th journalist to have been arrested at the shuttered paper. Other arrests include the newspaper's founder Jimmy Lai, and he's been sentenced to 14 months in prison for participating in the pro-democracy protests and also for propagating what the Chinese administration claims as anti-China sentiment amongst the people in Hong Kong. Remember, just last month, Hong Kong's police had raided Apple Daily's offices, taking hard drives and laptops as evidence. And now to give us more insights in terms of what these arrests of these people who were working in a publishing house actually mean, and what were these stories for which the Hong Kong police decided to pick them up. We're joined in by our correspondent Richard Kimber, who's joining us live from Hong Kong. Good afternoon to you, Richard. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on this broadcast on WION. So if you can shed more light, on the nature of the content that was being published by this publishing house, and why were these 5 individuals, why were they arrested?
Yes, well, local media has been reporting the details of these books all morning here. It's shown that these 3 publications that the police have found fault with effectively were children's books that somewhat mirrored real-life events that have taken place here in the last couple of years during what, of course, has been a time of political turmoil in Hong Kong. Just as an example, one of the books was called The 12 Warriors of Sheep Village, and it involved 12 sheep trying to flee their village because the village was being invaded by wolves. They then took to a boat to try to escape and were then captured and imprisoned. Now, that is very similar to a case of 12 young activists in Hong Kong who, during the course of the end of last year and the beginning of this year, became headline news in the city because they too tried to flee Hong Kong under prosecution from the police and were intercepted by the Chinese Coast Guard, arrested and then imprisoned in China. So it's this kind of approach that the police are taking now, where they see publications that are somewhat mirroring events from the events of the protest movement, perhaps glorifying the events, so the police say, and therefore they want these types of publications removed from the bookshelves, especially in the case of children's bookshelves, to make sure that these types of events are not, in the police's words, glorified or encouraged in the future.
Right, at this point of time, these books in which these stories appeared, were they like prescribed textbooks for children? And how young were the children for whom these books were meant for?
Well, these have certainly not been prescribed or approved by any of the educational authorities here. There's actually been somewhat of a clampdown on the type of materials that are being used in the education system, which is actually what prompted this small, privately operated, independent teaching union to produce these books themselves. These are not part of any national curriculum. They were, in the words of the teaching union, somewhat a reaction to the frustrations they felt of the rest of the education system coming under more control from the government. So really they were a reactive effort to try and show frustration towards the idea that perhaps in the coming years the rest of the Hong Kong education system will be somewhat censored or somewhat aligned with a more Chinese mainland style curriculum. That's why these books were being published, and that's why the police have tried to stop this process before it grows any further, and they say that this type of publication is no longer welcome in Hong Kong teaching at all.
Right, now, it's also a little far-fetched, for people who are looking at this story unfold in Hong Kong, where stories that were probably involved characters of sheep and wolves, these have now been taken off the table for children. Is the Hong Kong administration at this point of time saying that, look, publishing content will be very strictly regulated by the Hong Kong administration?
Well, that's very much the fear from publishers, also from the Journalists Association that's wrapped up in this from a media perspective. They all feel that this national security law, since it was introduced almost exactly a year ago, is now becoming much more wide-ranging than it was ever supposed to be. At the time of its introduction, the authorities promised that this would affect only a tiny percentage of the Hong Kong population who were deemed to be threatening national security. Now, what's remaining of the activist movement say this is simply not the case, that this law is being used to target everybody from small-time publishers to young activists who are still finishing university, and therefore they're concerned that the way that this law and other police legislation is being used is simply being crushing all forms of any opposition towards government or independent voices within the creative industries. And that's why there's great concern that although this case is very small and ultimately can seem innocuous to an international audience, that this is another step towards there being effectively a large-scale censorship across most of the arts and culture industry in Hong Kong.
Absolutely, indeed. And it's not just in creative writing, but even in journalistic writing, where we are given to understand that 4 staff members who worked for the now defunct for the company in which Jimmy Lai's newspaper, they were denied bail on the reasoning where the court believed that in future they could actually go on to write stuff that would be counterproductive for China. So does this effectively mean that independent journalism is pretty much now all but over in Hong Kong?
Well, again, there's great concern. Just yesterday I was talking to the former chairman of the Hong Kong Journalists Association. That association is accusing the police of instigating what it calls a white terror campaign against the media industry by continuing to arrest former executives of this now completely collapsed Apple Daily newspaper that used to be really the bastion of the pro-democracy voice in the media industry here. The fact that the police are still pursuing this investigation and arresting former staff from the newspaper, the Journalists Association say that's simply unacceptable because the newspaper has effectively collapsed now, so there's no need to continue to pursue these staff members. The police, though, say this is perfectly legitimate. It's nothing more than a regular exercise for them to pursue a case where there is evidence to suggest that there is national security being threatened, and that's why the arrests are being carried out, and they fundamentally deny that they're targeting in any way the media industry. But that's certainly how many in the media sector feel here, and for those few remaining independent news organisations that are trying to tell a more pro-democratic voice in the publications that they're putting out, there is great concern that they simply won't be able to operate in a few months' time because they, like the Apple Daily newspaper, will find themselves being targeted by some form of investigation that they simply haven't yet predicted.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Richard Kimber, for joining us and getting us all those updates there.